Aisquaichilsium. Osio. Hello. I'm Alex Darcy, and I'm the Associate Dean Research for the Faculty of Humanities at the University of Victoria. As I welcome you to this virtual lecture, I stand on the traditional and unceded territory of the Lekwungen. I'm an uninvited guest on these beautiful territories, and I express my gratitude and respect to the Songhees, the Esquimalt, and the Wasanich peoples, whose historical relationships with the land continue to this day. Likewise, I invite you to reflect upon the land from which you're engaging with this presentation today. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Jeff Corntassel, member of the Cherokee Nation, whose presentation, Indigenous Laws on Indigenous Lands, Land Back as Climate Action, will engage you, move you, and cause you to reflect on the relationship with both land and water, and on your understanding of the ways in which that relationship interacts with climate justice. Dr. Corntassel is an Associate Professor in Indigenous Studies and Associate Director of the Center for Indigenous Research and Community-Led Engagement here at UVic. His research and teaching focus on everyday acts of resurgence and the intersections between Indigenous sovereignty, climate change, and community well-being. He's an internationally recognized scholar whose research, teaching, and graduate supervision, as well as community engagement, are guided by the concept of working together for the benefit of all. The heart of his work is grounded in Indigenous communities and experiences, reflecting his commitment to ensuring that what happens at the university has meaning and impact far beyond the classroom. He is well known, for example, for his leadership on initiatives such as the 2018 Red Tide International Indigenous Climate Action Summit and the 2020 Rising Tides Climate Change and Indigenous Food Security Conference. Indigenous Laws on Indigenous Land both harnesses and showcases his commitment to making connections to the land and to its caretakers, and to his ability to integrate environmental science, critical theory, legal theory, and activism in ways that profoundly impact our relationships with the world around us. Wado. Thank you.
Osio Nigada, Jeff Ganoholido, Corntassel, Dagwadoa, Shalagi, Yetli, Gwena Sa'i, A Choda Galski Go'i. So my name is Jeff Corntassel. Hello everyone. Coming to you from the unceded lands of the Lekwungen peoples. And I wanted to honor the self-determining authority that these peoples have on this lands and these waters to this day. So I'm talking to you today about Indigenous laws on Indigenous lands, land back as climate action, and it's timely in the sense that UVic is developing a climate and sustainability action plan for 2022, and one of the things that we're doing as part of that plan, so Rabina, Thomas, and I are co-chairs of a task force group that is informing some of the work that's being done. It's called the Sacred Lands Working Group. Is to really center Indigenous knowledge in this discussion and center Indigenous knowledge in the plan itself. And so what you see on the screen are some of my relatives. And so you have Ojijata, Old Man Corntassel, and Susan Robbins. And they are the ones that walked that long forced walk to what became Oklahoma on the Trail of Tears in 1838. So they're survivors. And so I'm a relative of theirs. Their son, one of their sons, Johnston Corntassel, is my great-grandfather, along with Lula Knox. And then you see my grandfather, Robert J. Corntassel, and Florence Roberts, and then an older picture of me and my daughter. So when I talk to you about my nation, when I talk to you about land back, this is a generational discussion. This is a way of really linking back to our history and our ceremonial life. And so even the quote or the title for this talk, Indigenous Laws on Indigenous Lands, is kind of derived from a 1777 treaty negotiation that one of my relatives engaged in, where he basically said their whole cry is for more land. And he's talking about colonizers. And so basically saying they ask that we live like they do, may we not ask that they live like we do, right? On whose authority are there laws being imposed on our lands? And so when I talk about land back, when I talk about climate action, I'm rooted in that kind of historical discourse and that overall kind of action. So this is a relative of mine, Vivia Garner Cottrell from Cherokee Nation. And this is I always kind of orient myself with Cherokee words. So Nigaya Iso'i, which means despite hardship, we continue on. Even if we lose someone, we continue on. So that's a version of sustainable practice for Cherokees, is kind of that survival. And when confronted with adversity, we usually have these kind of 4 mantras. We survive, adapt, prosper, and excel. So we go through those 4 things every time that we confront one of life's adversities. And the reason I'm really highlighting Vivian in this picture is because river cane, or ihia, is something that's endangered on our nation. It's basically a version of bamboo. And it's harder and harder to come by because of flooding from climate change, also because on a lot of farmlands people are putting pesticides and other things like that that are killing off the river cane. And so Vivian is a basket maker, and she has been making baskets ever since she can recall, probably at an early age, around 10 or so. And her mother always challenged her to make baskets out of river cane. But how do you make baskets out of river cane when you've never done it before, and when it's harder and harder to find river cane? And so I use this story just to motivate us, but also to talk about the ways that as Indigenous peoples we practice resilience and resurgence. So shortly after her mother passed, she revisited this challenge and began this quest of how do you harvest river cane? Where do you find it? How do you kind of prepare it for basket making? A lot of our basket making materials are made out of things like split oak, honeysuckle, other materials like that, but not necessarily river cane. And there was virtually no one in our nation, in Cherokee Nation, that was making river cane baskets. And so she had to kind of learn on her own through trial and error. She also used YouTube. She used kind of techniques from other elders back east. And so through this kind of convergence of knowledge, she was able to start making river cane baskets. And this is just a sample of the work that she's been doing. This is the way that she is reconnecting with this age-old technology of basket making, but also applying it to river cane, which has been so important in the life of Cherokees. We use river cane for making chairs, even the sides of houses, blowguns, pipe stems, all these other uses, and yet basket making has kind of fallen to the wayside because of the lack of access to it. And so you can see from the pictures, she's doing amazing work, and her goal is to actually make a river cane basket that is waterproof, so you can actually hold water in it. And so this is the kind of thing that I'm talking about when I refer to sustainable self-determination. The ways in which we share and transmit that knowledge to future generations can be through any number of means. I mentioned YouTube, it could be through oral history, it could be through all these different ways. And it's not just it's not unidirectional. That is, it's not just going to younger generations. Younger generations are also feeding back to us their interpretations, their new expressions of sustainable practice. And so, Nigaya Iso'i, despite these hardships, we continue on. And we continue on so that we can nourish our people, so that we can live in abundance. And so here you see a picture of Woody Hansen, who's a storyteller, on his sort of family land that they're charged with protecting. And so this is a river he has to cross over private property to get to this spot, and we're actually gigging for crawdads. And so this epitomizes to me self-determination and sustainable self-determination, in that we are protecting those territories of life. We're protecting those relationships that promote our health and well-being as Indigenous peoples. And you see this worldwide, and you see this in other instances as well. This is a picture from Christy Belcourt, who's Métis, and it really shows the complexities of this, right? That we have a lot of intergenerational trauma. We have all these different kinds of struggles that we're dealing with on a personal level, but we also have this beauty. We have this ability to withstand these great challenges and share this knowledge with other people. And really, as I've been taught, knowledge is something that you share. It's not something that you hoard. So it brings us to land back, and land back has been really in the lexicon of a lot of people since kind of over the last 2 years. Really, in 2019, a lot of people online, tail feathers from Blackfoot and others began using this as a hashtag. And they began to use it as memes to kind of convey the need to return stolen land. And yet it's taken on a whole different life in different movements, and it's really inspired a lot of Indigenous nations and peoples to action. So the Yellowhead Institute has a nice study on land back if you want to read up more on that and kind of the origin of that term, but they describe it as consent-based jurisdiction. And when I talk about land back, I think of that phrase, Indigenous laws on Indigenous lands. It's really reasserting our jurisdictional authority on the land. So it may involve the rematriation of land directly to Indigenous nations. It also may involve asserting that jurisdictional authority on those lands and those waters in order to promote our health and well-being. And so it has different meanings depending on the community that we're talking about, or the communities that we're talking about, and the ways in which they need to be in relation to that land for their future generations. One of the ways it's looked on the West Coast is, this is Nuskmata, or Jacinda Mack, and she's reading out an eviction notice to juggernaut exploration. And so eviction from Indigenous Territories is another way of embodying land back. And so this happened in August 16th, 2021, and it was really to assert the governing authority of Nuhok peoples and the Nuhok kind of elders, in order to show that Juggernaut's presence on the land was a violation of Nuhok law. And so again, it gets to that point of Indigenous laws on Indigenous lands and the ways that these are reasserted. When we talk about climate change and climate action, I think it's always important to remember that climate change and even the expelling of greenhouse gases is a colonial problem. That is, when we think of colonization as a way of depriving us of those experiences with the natural world, and as a calculated way of doing that, we can think that we need to, at the core, address extractivist industries that are taking versus giving back, right? So if we think of another version of sustainable practice as giving more than you take, we can think of extractivist industries as taking more than they give, right? And we see in here the pictures of the wildfires in Australia that were rampant almost a year and a half ago. Also the spill on Heiltsuk land that occurred, that is still impacting the environment there. And then this statement that I went to a museum in Southern California, and it said, we'll need 70% more food by 2050. And I realized that that's actually the wrong message, in the sense that it's not that we need more food, we need to be replenishing the food systems that we have. And so regenerating those food systems, especially Indigenous food systems, is key to our future survival. And I'll talk about that a little bit later in the presentation. Another study that's come out recently through the Indigenous Environmental Network really shows that Indigenous resistance has, especially across Turtle Island, so they quantified this, has reduced greenhouse gases by 25% over the past 10 years, right? So land back is actually protecting the environment, and it's reducing the amount of greenhouse gases that are being put into the environment. So land back is about climate change, and it's about defending and protecting those territories of life from encroachment. It's no accident that over 80% of the world's biodiversity is on Indigenous lands, and so protecting those lands is key to our as Indigenous nations, but also Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples need to recognize that that is our future. That is the way that we are going to get through this together in some ways, but also honor those relationships, those sacred relationships that promote our health and well-being. Leanne Simpson, who's a Anishinaabe scholar and activist, talks about resurgence as something that's concerned with the reattachment of our minds, bodies, and spirits and the network of relationships and ethical practices that generate grounded normativity. And you can think of grounded normativity as something that comes from Glenn Coulthard, a Dene scholar, as those ethical frameworks that are grounded, are literally grounded in, are rooted in our land-based practices and our water-based practices. So understanding that those relationships are key to our resurgence. They're the key to our ability to reconnect with land, culture, and community. And some of my work is focused on everyday acts of resurgence, those kinds of actions that are often hidden from view, that are unseen, unacknowledged actions, things that happen in our backyards, at our family dinner tables, in the kitchen, on private property, in ceremony, all of these things that are often hidden from view, but are significant in that they're actually teaching us how to engage in relational accountability. So this is my daughter, Leela, and she's helping a turtle across the road in Oklahoma. This is a snapping turtle, so she's holding it properly. And turtle in our language is doxy. And so this is something that seems like it's a really mundane action, right? She's helping a turtle across the road. But in the larger scheme of things, turtles for Cherokees are part of our kind of network of relational kind of responsibilities. And so doxy is what carries us to different worlds, because doxy goes on land and water. So Cherokees will sometimes say we come from 4 worlds back, and it's that doxy that brings us through those worlds. The other thing that doxy does is a key part of our ceremony is that women and girls in our ceremonies wear turtle shells on their ankles. And so they wear those shells, and we call it shaking shells. They shake those shells to keep the rhythm of the dance. And so doxy is a key part of our ceremonial life. And it's really what keeps our dance going, what keeps us moving. And so when you don't have turtle shells, in the case of, and sometimes in Oklahoma it's harder and harder to find turtles, you wear tin cans. So my daughter has a 4x4 tin cans that she wears on each ankle to honor that doxy, to honor that relationship. So on the surface, it's helping a turtle across the road. In the deeper sense, we're talking about learning and practicing sustainability. We're learning and practicing that notion of Nigaya Iso-i. It's embodying it through our everyday acts. The other thing I wanted to talk about in relation to sustainable self-determination is kind of our notion of internationalism. As Indigenous peoples, we have different expressions of the international that don't correspond with state-centered systems, right? So we have a different notion of borders. We have a different notion of boundaries. And in that sense, we have different sense of how we practice those relational kind of responsibilities. And so what I've done is I'll point out a few examples here of Indigenous relationships that have been formalized through treaties for and by Indigenous nations. And you can think of all sorts of different ways that we express these solidarities through our stories, through our sacred living histories, through ceremony. But these are just some examples that have been in the kind of more recent events. And so one of them is the Indigenous Women of the Americas Defenders of Mother Earth Treaty Compact that was signed in 2015. This came from the film The Condor and the Eagle, and it's really linking the struggles of Indigenous women across the Americas. So it's really talking about the ways in which Indigenous women are practicing sustainability on their own homelands. And it's a commitment by them to actually engage in some sort of sustainable practice each year so that this treaty can be renewed and continued. Right? So this is another creative way of thinking about climate change through a treaty. The other is the Buffalo Treaty that was signed in 2014 between Blackfoot nations. And this is a treaty all about their relationship with buffalo in order to honor and nurture that relationship and ultimately reintroduce buffalo back into their territory, which they've done. So it was signed in 2014, again, by and for Indigenous nations, 9 signatories in 2014. It's been renewed each year through ceremony, and each year more and more people have been added as signatories. So now we're up to, I think, about 29 signatories to this treaty, really to honor that relationship. And this is Leroy Little Bear, who's Blackfoot, Kainai First Nation, and really talking about the vitality of that buffalo. When the buffalo disappears, our songs, our stories, and our ceremonies will all be empty acts. So acknowledging that, thinking of the buffalo as as Nancy Turner would say, cultural keystone species. It's a key part of Blackfoot life, and honoring that and ultimately protecting that. Another treaty that was signed in 2015 was the Heiltsuk and Haida Treaty. This has a lot of history to it, and basically, this was a treaty that was signed ultimately to protect the herring, fisheries, and to also reignite that relationship that had been stalled or that had been disrupted over the past 100 years or so. And it was done in ceremonies, done through potlatch. It was also done using copper as a witness, right? And so it had all of these elements that go far deeper than maybe standard international relations or other state kind of centric activities would indicate. It's also important to realize or recognize the connection between land and body when we talk about Indigenous nations and peoples, that what happens to the land also happens to our bodies. And more specifically, Indigenous women, girls, Two-Spirit, and queer peoples are disproportionately impacted by extractive industries. And so the Tiny House Warriors have been our Secwepemc land defenders, led by Kanahus, Manuel, and others, recognized this early in 2017, where they wrote a women's declaration, basically saying no man camps, right? No industrial camps on our land, because we've seen when man camps are introduced in an area for building pipelines, for building other extractivist industries, it leads to an increase in assault rates and violence against Indigenous women, girls, Two-Spirit, and queer peoples. And so recognizing this link between land and body is another part of our understanding of climate change, and how, as Indigenous peoples, we are impacted disproportionately by extractivist industries, but also by the changes to our environment. Another kind of interesting movement has been the right of legal personhood that's been granted to rivers and to lakes and to mountains even. The Whanganui River was granted legal personhood in Aotearoa, or New Zealand, in 2017. And since then we've seen all sorts of other examples where rivers are granted legal personhood, and if we think of this as an extension of land back, as kind of reasserting that jurisdictional authority, this is another way, legally speaking, that Indigenous peoples are reclaiming these relationships and reclaiming them so that they can protect those rivers in perpetuity. And the most recent example in Canada, and the first example, is the Magpie River attain legal personhood in Quebec. And so, again, we're seeing this movement continue on. Another site of resurgence, and we think of resurgence as another way of kind of turning away from the state. It's a way of, in a sense, refocusing our energies on those relationships that nurture us and that benefit us as Indigenous peoples. And so Mauna Kea is a site of Hawaiian resurgence, Kanaka Maoli resurgence. And Mauna Kea is one of the highest mountains in the world. If you measure it from kind of its base, which is underwater, all the way to the top. It's also a sacred place. It's a place you go for prayer. It's a place that you don't live at necessarily because it's not, it's very difficult to live there, right? So it's never been a place that you continuously stay. But it's also a place where a 30-meter telescope was proposed for the top of Mauna Kea. And this 30-meter telescope was going to be something on the order of 20 stories high. It was going to leave, I think a devastating footprint on the top of this mountain. And Kanaka Maoli people refused. And they said, we did not consent to this. You do not have our free, prior, and informed consent. And so in 2019, in July of 2019, elders, Kapuna, kind of took the front lines of standing in the way of the 30-meter telescope being built. And I believe it was over 37, 38 elders, Kapuna, were arrested in July of 2019. Other people, other Hawaiians were chaining themselves to cattle grates, basically to prevent this 30-meter telescope from being built on this land. And with the arrest of the Kapuna, one of the largest movements in Hawaiian history emerged, where 3,000 Kanaka Maoli converged on this area to support their Indigenous brothers and sisters. And so this is still an ongoing struggle, but again, it shows the necessity of protecting our lands, protecting our waters. Mauna Kea is also the source of drinking water, source of an aquifer for that area. And so we're talking about that protection is about the survival, but also the future of Kanaka Maoli people. So I was able to visit this place when they kind of made an encampment near the base, and there were some really interesting things that were happening. For one thing, there was solidarity across different Indigenous nations, so you could see this kind of string of flags, including Cherokee Nation. A Cherokee had gotten there before I had gotten there, so I was surprised and pleasantly surprised to see Cherokee Nation flag flying, but also all of the things that were being done to sustain this movement. And so there were, it was under the kind of mandate of kapu aloha, which means peaceful interaction, but it was also, there are several rules that you had to adhere to in order to live at this camp or stay at this camp. And you had to make yourself available to volunteer for the kind of keeping the camp going. The other thing that was so vital to this movement was there were protocols that were done each day at 8:30 a.m., 12, and again at 5:30. And each time, that entire road leading onto Mauna Kea was filled with people doing chants and dances and focusing on that mountain, focusing that energy on that mountain in order to protect it. And so that kept people's focus on what was important in terms of respecting and honoring that relationship. The other innovation at Mauna Kea was the Pu'uhuluhulu University, which was basically a university on the lava rocks. And so each day you would have the opportunity to take classes. You would be able to discuss Hawaiian history, discuss sustainability, discuss the Hawaiian language, all on these rocks each day. And it's an important site of learning as well as regeneration. I think another, getting closer to where we're at here on Lekwungen territory, A big part of the movement here has been to regenerate Kwetlal, or camas. And camas is a bulb that's a key food source and a key food staple for the peoples of this territory. And so, led by Cheryl Bryce and other people from Songhees and the Esquimalt and Wusanich, basically Kwetlal is under siege. 95% of the Kwetlal food system has been destroyed over the past 50 years or so. And so some of the destructive behavior has been from the introduction of invasive species to this area. And so there's Cheryl on the right side. So she started this Lekwungen Community Toolshed in 2009 with this idea of being able to manage with other people her family's territories, which they've been managing for thousands of years. And so she invites Indigenous and non-Indigenous people to co-manage these areas with her direction and pull invasive species so that Kwetlal can thrive. And here we've put a pile of Scottish broom on the commemoration to the Queen. It's kind of a regift, if you will. But it points out the need to recognize that colonization itself is ongoing and it takes many different forms. We can also think about other ways that communities themselves have approached climate change strategies, and the Inuit have come up with their own climate change strategy across Inuit Nunangat. And so it deals with things like food security and food sovereignty, deals with invasive species. It's a very detailed look at what needs to happen in order for Inuit people to thrive into the future. Another movement that I was involved in, and it's still ongoing, is the Red Tide Climate Action Summit. And it was Indigenous-led, and it took place in Aotearoa, or New Zealand, and it was hosted by Te Kaha Marae, which was one of the communities on the East Coast in 2018, the summer of 2018. And the goal was really to invigorate youth in this movement to take action so that there could be sustainable practice on those lands, and also to address the invasive species, whether it's plants or animals, so that the species from that area could thrive. And you could see some of the participants. It was kind of an anti-conference in the sense that it was geared towards grassroots mobilization and it was locally focused. So people like me, Cherokees that came all the way across from Turtle Island, were there to offer support and also offer our own insights in terms of the experiences we've had with climate action. But it was the youth that picked up the action right away and started incorporating some of these practices into their schools. It's also important to talk about allyship and resurgence. When we talk about, I like this quote from Michael Elliott, that these spaces of resurgence, and we think back to maybe the Indigenous youth that were occupying the steps of the legislature just last year. They were inviting people to take part in that, to support their actions. It was an action in support of Wet'suwet'en, but they were, it's principled or kind of focused on reciprocity, that is, giving back, right? And so these spaces of resurgence are structured not on but for the principle of reciprocity. They presuppose Indigenous centricity and authority, and in doing so, figure settlers as guests. If they are to remain welcome, settlers are under the requirement to adapt their behavior and meet with conditions of hospitality that they've had no say in determining, right? So understanding that being a good guest means taking direction from the Indigenous peoples of the territory. And in doing so, it's not about self-proclaiming yourself as an ally, it's about understanding and taking the lead from the Indigenous peoples of this area. And this is the final slide here, Awakening Memory, and I like this work by Marianne Nicholson, who's Kwakwaka'wakw, and this is really, this is a family crest. It's a story that's literally painted on the side of one of the rocks, one of the rock formations in her territory. And it's really about jarring our memories. You think about a lot of resurgence is remembering and acting on those remembrances so that our people can thrive. And so when we talk about Indigenous laws on Indigenous lands, it's about reasserting that jurisdictional authority that we have, and it's all about that notion of consent-based jurisdiction when we talk about land back, so that our future generations can be healthy, so that our future generations can continue on. Nigaya iso I. So I'll close there. Wado. Thank you.